So a facilitator's role is to guide a group of people to a particular outcome. Now, at some point you are going to run into people who are perhaps not helpful in helping reach that outcome that you're after. That might be because they talk too much, it might be because they interrupt, it might be because they're too quiet. There's a range of different types, and in this video we're going to talk about how to handle that. It's important to keep control of the group, because once you've lost control of a group and the group has kind of taken over and starting to guide themselves in what they're doing next, it's very difficult for a facilitator to recover that. Now, the one thing you can do for all workshops, which is great practice to managing all kinds of situations and gives everybody confidence, is prep the room in advance. If you're working online, then prep the whiteboard, the online whiteboard. And that means getting some flip charts up. You might have a parking lot section, you might have an agenda, you might have a welcome sign written on a flip chart, but having maybe a brown paper planning exercise, maybe whatever you're working on, matrices, there's 1,000 different types that you might prep in the room. It's really helpful because it clearly shows the group that you have a plan, and they are much more likely to go along and follow what you're asking them to do if they can see that the day in front of them is already planned and well thought through. So let's talk about how you manage the quieter people, those that don't really want to share their perspective. Now, that might be because they are genuinely shy and introvert people. It might be because they're not confident in their point, or don't feel like their contribution is as important as other people's in the room. Might be because they're actually really clear about the outcome and have done lots of preparation and are kind of waiting, biding their time. A load of reasons why someone might be quiet. So the first thing to say is you can try, for example, post-it notes. So one of the things we use a lot in our workshops, as you know, is post-it notes. All over the wall behind me. Give people some post-it notes, ask them to spend a few minutes jotting down their thoughts, 1 point per post-it note. Now what you've done is even the quietest person in the room has written something. That gives you now an opportunity to ask them. So that involves them and gets their point in. A similar approach is to put them into small groups. So you can have groups of 2 or 3 people, just could be talking to your neighbour. That gets them again talking. You then have 2 opportunities. One is to ask them to feedback what was said. So if they're underconfident about their opinion or the points they want to make, they can talk about what their partner or the rest of their group talks about. But it also gives you the opportunity just to ask, what were you talking about? So it's less who would like to come in now and more tell me what you were talking about. It's harder to avoid that and does encourage people to speak. Ask them by name to come in. It's another technique. So you can literally just say, Sue, what do you think about that point? So it's a good way of doing it. Move closer. So get use your body, use your gestures to move closer to them. Keep eye contact with them and smile and nod whenever they speak. Smiling and nodding is a great reward mechanism. It gives everybody, all humans love it, makes you feel like your point's valuable, someone's listening. So smile and nod whenever they're speaking. Interestingly, we're going to come back to that once we talk about managing people who talk too much. Write their point on the flip chart so that you're showing that it's important to you. Ask a follow-up question about their point. You can invite others to potentially contribute to that as well and test that point with others. Importantly, particularly at the beginning of the sessions, the first time people come in, don't cut them off. Definitely don't tell them that their point isn't relevant. It's kind of almost worth in those first few interactions being a bit more clumsy so that you don't set a message that says your points aren't relevant and make people feel even more reticent to share their opinion. And finally, for quiet people, if you're working in a big venue, so you've got microphones, then really think hard about where you are with that microphone. If you've watched our other videos, you'll know I rarely give someone the microphone. I will hold the microphone for them, so I can then turn them around. If I want them to face the other way, if they're shy, I might turn them away from the audience a little so they're looking at me. I keep eye contact with them, and I might even crouch down a little bit just so that they can see that they're looking down at me and they're feeling a little bit more like they're talking to me and not to the big group. So there you go, some tips for handling quiet people to get more from them and make sure that their contribution, which is often more valuable than the people that are happy to share, but getting their opinion and contribution to the group. So what do you do when someone's talking too much? Now, this will happen in most workshops that you will be operating. Certainly any group size of 9 or 10 or more people, there's always someone that's perhaps more confident or happier to share their opinion. So how do you deal with that? Well, firstly, it's important to write down the point that they've made on the flip chart or whiteboard or whatever you're using. That shows you we've got it. So we don't need you to keep telling us in a long and verbose way everything you can think of to do with this subject. So write it down firstly on the flip chart. If they're rambling a lot, then you can ask them to summarize the point for the flip chart. I often use that, where I'll say to the person, can you just then help me, I need a really short sentence to put on the flip chart. Sometimes they begin their repeat and go over again. You can then turn and have a smile at them and stop writing on the flip chart until they do give you a short summary. So that really helps to make them summarize their own opinion. Now, a bit the opposite of dealing with quiet people, I would purposely avoid eye contact when they're speaking. Now, so I might certainly be looking away from them and maybe looking at the flip chart, maybe turn my back on them completely so that I'm making it more difficult for them to kind of see my reaction. I'm encouraging them not to keep talking to me. You can position yourself directly behind them. That's an interesting thing to do. If someone's talking too much, they're trying to follow you around the room when you're walking around, and I will quite often go and stand directly behind them, and it's really difficult for them to see me, and it just makes it slightly more uncomfortable for them to be speaking. That's what I'm trying to do, frankly, is to try and get them to stop speaking so much by making it a bit more difficult for them every time. You can look at your watch while they're talking. It's a slightly tricky one when you get into that territory because everybody knows that signal, and obviously you don't want to be rude to people in your workshop, but it can help sometimes just to have a little kind of discreet look at your watch. They see you do that, they get a bit of a message. There's a really nice trick or tip that we use, which starts off at the beginning of the workshop. Bring some sweets along, and normally I would say something like, here's some sweets, I've brought them along just to keep our energy levels up, make sure that we're all able to concentrate, and then I'll show a bag of toffee and I'll say, and here's some toffees, and if you talk too much, I'm going to offer you a toffee. Why that's great is because when someone is speaking a bit too much, you can just reach for that bag of toffees and give it a little shake. Everybody knows the story. It's a smile that you do it with, but you're making the clear point that you're talking too much. So what do we do in a situation where you've got an argumentative or a combative person? So this is the personality type that likes to kind of put their point forcefully and potentially disagree. I disagree with what they've just said and here's why, and potentially being quite sort of almost aggressive about the way that they're doing things. So it all starts pretty much the same for all of these personality types. Get their point on the flip chart, write it up so that you're clearly showing you've heard it. That kind of immediately takes the wind out of anyone's sails a little bit, because it's like, okay, the point's been made. And when you if you want to kind of keep going and keep remaking the same point, I can just point back at the flip chart and I can say, so is this a different point, or is this have we captured this point already? You can then, if it's a particularly outlying comment, an outlier, you can ask, recap on the other points that you might have on your flip chart or that have been made already by the group. And then ask the group for alternative perspectives. So your job as facilitator isn't to take on that argument. Your job is to make sure that the group get to their outcome. So you want to dampen down the argumentativeness a bit, but actually if their point is quite different, that's probably a useful conversation you got to have. So involve the other group, but manage that carefully so that you're not creating an argument. And you do that through recapping the points on the flip chart. And if it gets a little bit heated, then just make sure you're capturing the points. Stop the conversation. Say, okay, can I just make sure I've got that point? Because it's important that we hear what you've said. So is it fair to say X, Y, Z, whatever the point is that they've made? Put it on the flip chart. It kind of just dampens down the ability to be argumentative every time you're stopping them to make it clear. And of course, that's your job as a facilitator, to make it as simple as you can. If their point is a bit off the wall or not part of the agenda, this is where your parking lot or open issues for discussion is a really useful tool. So have that prepared in the room already, put the point on the parking lot, then say we can come back to this if there's time later today, or make sure it's written up in the report and we can come back to it another time. If the combative and argumentative point is sort of taking over a bit and keeps coming back up, then small group discussion is something to think about, because you can instantly do that, break them into small groups. That at least takes that person out into a smaller group, and the rest of the group can kind of move on a little. Stay close to that small group though, and you might want to make sure that the people in that group are strong characters so that they can handle any sort of difficulties there. Small groups works really well, but stay close to them, particularly those individuals that are difficult. Chatty folk. So these are people that are having side conversations all the time. They're constantly sort of distracting someone around them from the main event. The first thing I always try with this person, or this kind of small group that's chatting, is the head teacher stare. So we've all experienced that kind of teacher stare of the kind of looking at you like this. If you've got glasses, you can look over your glasses at them. I will often make that and make it kind of jestful. So I'm not trying to be too difficult. I'll give them a look and then I'll go, "That's a head teacher stare. Do you remember those at school?" And it kind of brings a little bit of humour into what's otherwise quite difficult. It's really important to early on set the scene that this isn't acceptable, but you don't need to be confrontational about that. But it is important the first time or times people are having side conversations that you deal with it. Make it clear that's not what we're here to do. How do you do that? Well, you can pause the conversation. So I'll often, if I'm writing a point on a flip chart, listening to someone here and someone over there is starting to have a chat, I'll stop and I'll say, let's just wait until that we can all focus on the point that we're making here. It works really well. It's not confrontational, and typically the people having the conversation realise what's happening and tend to wrap up pretty quickly. Another simple trick, and this is all back from school really, is to go and stand right next to them. So I will often walk round. We're going to do a video on room layouts and why they're important, and this is one of the reasons they're important, is because I will often walk around. I might stand directly between them and someone they're talking to. If I can stand next to them and block their view of the person next to them, that's helpful, but just standing right behind them works really well because they know that you're right there. They tend not to be chatting when you're the facilitator standing next to them. That also works well if someone's on their phone or distracted doing email or something else. So you can just make sure that you are right next to them. They know they're being watched and they tend to toe the line a little bit and pay a bit of attention. You can also try the age-old teacher tactic of asking them to share. So I will sometimes pretend I pretty much know that they're having a side conversation that's nothing to do with what we're talking about, but I might pretend to think that they're talking about the agenda point. So I might nip over and say, can you share what you were just talking about? I want to make sure we capture it. And then they often like, oh no, sorry, I was just talking about a meeting we've got next week or something like that. So that's quite a good way. And here's another humorous thing that I quite often use is I'll go and join in the conversation. So I might go and sneak over and kind of crouch down next to them and go, yeah, what is it? What are we going on about? And just make it a little bit funny. Obviously, it depends on the setting, depends who you're working with, but I use that quite a lot. It gets a bit of a laugh. It takes the tension out of it. But ultimately, you are being very clear. Side conversations aren't allowed. We aren't going to allow them. I'm going to intervene. There are some people who will go massively off topic. So digressers, we might call them. And they are bringing up all kinds of points and you don't know how it's relevant to what we're doing in this session. They probably don't know how it's relevant either, frankly. So what do you do about them? So the first thing to do is to comment, are we off topic? So provided it's obviously off topic, sometimes if you're in complex discussions, it might not be that easy for you to know whether it's relevant. So you might have to play it out a little bit. But I will often just draw it and say, okay, so is that relevant to this point? Or is it one of the other points? Or is it something we need to talk about later? So I'm really saying to them, what? What are you going on about? You can then ask them, where does the point belong? Is it part of a point on the agenda here? Is it part of this point? If I've been using my flip chart throughout the session to keep a bit of a kind of track of the conversation, then it's sometimes helpful. What that tends to do is to show them that it's not part of any of it, and they might agree that it belongs on a parking lot, or indeed that it doesn't need to be recorded anywhere because they're just rabbiting on about something. Summarising where we are is a great way after someone might have gone off on a tangent talking about who knows what, is listen to what they've had to say, they wrap up, then you might say, okay, very good, so here's where we are. And really what you're doing is reframing that group's conversation into the objectives and aims that we're trying to cover. So you might just go back through some of the points that were recently made that you might have captured on a flip chart or just have in your head, and that just reframes the group and kind of ignores the point that was just made. Generally that works quite well. Remember, the group is the expert, so you can ask for other opinions from the group. You don't necessarily need to be dealing with this. If it's obviously off on a tangent, then probably you do need to deal with it. That's your job. When you're not sure, then you can bring in the other group and say, does anyone else share that perspective? And that will typically, you'll get very normally silence if it's complete tangent, or someone might helpfully bring you back towards the agenda. So you can try that. And the final thing is for dealing with digressers, people that go off at a tangent, is what I have seen in the UK. There's the question time, used to be run by, chaired by a chap called David Dimbleby. He had a brilliant way of dealing with questions from the audience which were arguably a bit inane or completely off topic. And he would say, someone would say, well, I want to ask what the group thinks of this. And he would say, what do you think? Straight back to the audience member. And they'd say, well, I think it's obviously yes. And then he'd go, great, next question. Brilliant way of kind of just putting it back, closing it immediately and moving on. So you might try that if you're feeling brave. Very occasionally you might run into people that are overly emotional. So this might be that they genuinely get upset that some of the points have been made, or they want to make a point, they make it with such passion that it genuinely either upsets them or maybe angers them. How you deal with that, it's the most sensitive of the personality types, I guess, to deal with, or the problem moments. Firstly, try and get the point. So you're again going to use your own flip chart technique to say, okay, this is clearly an area that you'll feel very passionate about. Can I try and make sure we capture this? So try and taking the emotion out. What we're trying to do is dial down the emotion and get to the actual facts, the points that people want to make. So that can help a little bit with showing that it's important and we're capturing it, but also trying to make it a bit more factual rather than capturing the emotion and the energy that's come with it. It's important to listen really carefully, particularly if someone is feeling really passionate and emotional or upset about something. So make sure you're paying attention and are using your very best empathy to stay close to them, to keep eye contact, to kind of nod along with what they're saying. You can then ask them if there are other perspectives, other ways of looking at this, and indeed ask the group. So you've got to be really careful. If they're super upset about whatever's happened, then winding that up into a bigger conversation might be dangerous. So you have to use some of your facilitator spidey sense to work out which way is what's the right way of approaching it. But sometimes it's helpful to get the group talking about it. Sometimes it's helpful just to summarize and bring it to a close. You can take a break, remember. So sometimes it's helpful if someone is upset, take a break. You can then have a little one-to-one with them and just settle them back down and make sure that you're back in, getting them refocused on what we're here to do, and hopefully showing them that you've listened, that you understand, but obviously you've got a workshop to run and we need to carry on, not just focusing on one point. And the final part with dealing with people who are emotional is get their permission to move on. So you don't need to kind of just ignore it and park it and pretend it didn't happen. You can talk about it, get the point, and then say, are we okay to move on now? Typically, it's rare that someone's going to go, no, I want to make this point again. It does happen. It's pretty rare. If that happens, take a break. So this video is all about managing different types of personality type. The important thing as a facilitator is to understand that all of the opinions that they're going to give you, that people have, are really valuable. Somebody that's got a really outlying opinion is brilliant to make the conversation work, but also may well be the innovator and the breakthrough that you really need to think about for your project strategy or whatever you're working on. So the tools and techniques, the tips and techniques that I've shared in this video really are all about helping you to get the best from a whole bunch of different personality types so that everybody gets involved, everybody gets heard, and ultimately you achieve a better outcome. What's not to love?